record on this computer. So we are now recording. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, and for the record, for the recording, Zoom now requires me to admit everybody one by one individually, and we believe that this is a measure to prevent Zoom bombing, which you may have read about in the New York Times, where someone sneaks into a Zoom meeting and unexpectedly dumps pornography or racist slogans or just the worst kind of stuff you can imagine. If that should happen to us, we're going to take it in stride, of course. We'll take it as a as a teaching moment, but I think if we're admitting everybody and all of you all are, as it were, pre-screened, that is probably not going to happen. However, it does complicate things for me because I need to sit here in the first minutes and kind of monitor the incoming participants. So I'm sorry about that. But let me try to get started anyway. I am going to project try to project my PowerPoint. See, I'm afraid if I project my PowerPoint, I'm not going to be able to see people requesting admission. And now I'm trying to admit people. Ognian, are you there? Type yes in chat if you are. All right, so sorry, this has really distracted me. I'm doing my best to adapt to this new reality. All right, here we go. I'm going to project my screen, share screen, and I'm hoping I'll be able to see requests to come join us. I'm not seeing requests to join us when I do share screen, which means that at least for the moment, I am not going to project my PowerPoint, at least for the moment. Once we have our critical mass of people here, I will go back to my PowerPoint. All right, so welcome back. We've got a lot to do. Like last week, we've got two presentations. The first is from John Kulvitsky, and the second is from Alexandra Grundler. And I'm looking forward to both of those. And the format is going to be much like last time, in that we are going to have a general summary of important points from me, followed by a presentation, followed by discussion of the presentation, then a second presentation, then some discussion, and finally a general kind of working or re-investigation of all of the material from the presentations. Though, again, as last week, my presentation is going to be, as it were, biased towards the first half, simply because it's a question of time. That's all the time that I will have. So I'm going to be talking primarily about sections 30 through 41, roughly, which are also the sections that are going to be discussed in the first presentation by John today. So in that respect, Alexandra will be somewhat more on her own, and I don't know which approach each of our two speakers would in fact prefer, but that's just how it's going to be. Now, you know, I've been thinking a lot about our approaches in this seminar. There are aspects of it that I find more difficult than live seminar. Oh, one very important quasi-administrative thing that I wanted to reiterate. This seminar has somewhat the character of a of purposiveness without purpose itself. If you follow me, we are doing something that seems to implicate an end, even if we cannot explicitly say what the end is. So the seminar itself mirrors the subject matter of the third critique itself, which is kind of cool. That said, and this is what I'm reiterating, if you are a student enrolled in a philosophy program somewhere in the world, and this seminar might be appropriate for an independent study, and your institution allows you to do that sort of thing, once again, please let me know and we can work something out. That's something that's going to differ from one institution to another, but if it's possible, I'm game, in which case we will have a purpose in the more concrete sense. It will be purposiveness with purpose in that case. Otherwise, I think it's a nice kind of symmetry between our approach and the work itself. Now, I wanted, and again, I'm only not showing you my PowerPoint presentation for the moment, because if I do, then I can't see the participants who want to join. And let me just also say, there are some people joining us for the first time today. If you are one of them, I'll just remind you that there is a kind of new method of interaction to get used to. Your microphones should all be muted right now. You can still, without unmuting your microphone, you can still interact with me and with the rest of the group, and you do so via chat. And we should all be able to see the chats. And once again, it's useful and gratifying to see small chats coming in, even if it's just something like interesting with or without exclamation point. That's good. You don't have to do that, but if the spirit moves you, go ahead and do it. It's appreciated. And you can also pose a question there. If it turns out to be an elaborate question, then we can move to the next intensity level and unmute your microphone so that you can state it vocally. But the first step is chat. All right. So I wanted to spend until about 12:15 saying a few more words about the sublime, which was Ognjan's focus in his presentation last week, though I think there are aspects of it that we did not fully get to, or that at least I myself was not able to get to. So this is, again, this lag that I'm talking about, where I'm not fully able to go back over the details of the text from the second presentation. So then I come back the following week and tie that off. That's what I'm doing this week. And that's also almost certainly what I'm going to be doing next week with the material Alexandra covers in her presentation today. So I want to take until about 12:15 to discuss some of the important remaining issues concerning the sublime. Now you'll notice into the deduction of the judgments of taste, there is an important dialogue between the beautiful and the sublime that continues. So from at least sections 30 to 41, the sublime and how it differs from the beautiful remains a very important issue. Very briefly, I wanted to turn our attention to section 29. So going back before the reading for today, section 29, I don't have the precise Academy edition numbers, but perhaps someone can throw that in the chat function. For a greater culture, Kant says, not merely of the aesthetic power of judgment, but also of the cognitive faculties on which that is based, seems to be requisite in order to be able to make a judgment about the excellence of objects of nature. That should be, now I'm seeing around page 148 of the Geyer edition, 5265 of the Academy edition. The Academy edition is the marginal pagination that you'll see, the 5, and that's actually the German volume that's available at the link at corpora.org that I sent you early on. That's a reference to the page numbers of that edition. You can avail yourself of it if you know German. See, I'm still getting people coming to join us, so that's why I'm not, oh yeah, thank you, Virtual From. It's page 148 in the Geyer. So ordinarily from now on, I'm going to try to give you both the Academy edition number followed by the Geyer number. But if I don't do that systematically, I'm sorry. Now, after that, the line that I just read you, there is a long passage that I don't want to read to you. I was going to project it, that says something to the effect that a certain Herr de Saussure, that's not Ferdinand de Saussure, I forgot to check who that is exactly, maybe an ancestor, relates talking to a Savoyard peasant who is disdainful of those adventurous, likely well-to-do young men who are keen on going and experiencing some alpine precipices. Why? Well, because for the Savoyard peasant, alpine precipices are just a danger, a threat, and an obstacle to getting where they want to go, right? And this is a really interesting example. You might know, if you're a Germanist, that there is what you might call a subgenre of early Weimar era silent cinema called Alpine films that are all about mountaineering in the Alps and falling off of precipices and gazing into precipices and so on. And this is significant. This is, you might call, a late echo of German Romanticism in Weimar era cinema that is about to cross over into Nazi ideology. But it is an example, a kind of stock example in the history of Romanticism of the sublime. And we see here, not necessarily, I never want to lay claim to a first instance of something, but we see here Kant mobilizing this example to make what I take to be a pretty important distinction. Ognian, thanks for jumping in. This particular Saussure is Horace Bénédict de Saussure, 1740 to 99, the Genevan geologist and physicist who made the second ascent of Mont Blanc in 1787. Fascinating. I had no idea, but thanks again, Ognian. Make sure your mics are off. If maybe I can mute all. I hate to do that. It feels authoritarian, but I just muted y'all. So again, first approach, if you want to interact, it's by chat. Okay, so this is an interesting example, but what I wanted to emphasize here is that this and the preceding quotation I gave you are spots where Kant evokes the notion of culture. Culture is a very important and difficult concept that I just wanted to briefly acknowledge here. There's a wonderful, I mean, I can think of a lot of literature on this coming more from historians and anthropologists than from philosophers. Simon Cooper has a wonderful book called Culture, and there's a subtitle, I forget what it is, and it's often seen as kind of becoming salient for the first time in the context of late 18th century German reflections on the inadequacy of the French notion of civilization. So we often get culture in contrast with civilization. One thing that's important to note, though, is as in French and German even today, and in this, I take it, somewhat intentionally archaic English translation of Geyer's, culture here is something more like a process, right? It's a synonym or near synonym of cultivation, like what one does when one tends to the fields. And it is obviously in the first instance an agricultural metaphor. That's where the word culture comes from. And Kant hears those resonances when he himself uses culture here, right? So it would be very important in later parts of the critique to see, for example, the way Kant distinguishes between the kinds of experience that require culture in contrast with the kinds of experience that that are the same whether you've got culture or not. And by culture, we mean, again, something like the cultivation of a sensibility. And the first instance where this comes up is the experience of the sublime. The peasant experiences the alpine precipices as a distraction and a threat. The cultured person experiences them as an occasion on which to kind of reflect on the way the representation of nature points to the supersensible, because one is not in experience capable of apprehending all at once what is being presented to her or him in a sublime scape. For that reason, it forces the individual to experience a feeling of the supersensible, a non-representational feeling of the supersensible, and this is the last thing I'll say about the sublime, that implicates ideas rather than concepts of the understanding, and sends the observer into a reflection upon our own limits in the representation of nature, rather than on nature itself. And this is fundamentally a moral experience, right? So we're kind of building on lessons we've already learned in both the first and the second critiques to get a full and adequately rich understanding of what the experience of the sublime is. In contrast with the experience of the beautiful, it is something that points to the supersensible, first of all, and second of all, and well, relatedly, implicates the moral self, right? And Kant has lots of interesting things to say in this part of the third critique about the moral goodness of reflection on nature in contrast with the experience of works of art. And I find this really interesting. He says, you know, you've read it, but when he says things to the effect that someone who is admiring his collection of trinkets and tchotchkes for their aesthetic value should probably set off your red flag that you're not in the presence of a fully morally well-grounded person, whereas by contrast, someone who is out there admiring the moss on stones and butterflies and so on is probably pretty solid morally. And I'm not really doing that justice. And you can all probably think of counterexamples, but in any case, I think that's an interesting observation on his part. I want to move on from the sublime simply because I don't have any more time to engage with it today. And I want to try to work our way towards the presentations until about 12:35. So for the next 15 minutes, I'd like to talk about today's key concepts and questions. Now, for better or worse, I'm going to go to share screen, which means that we're not going to be able to see any latecomers who want to join us. So we've got a pretty small group today. I see that there are 22 of us, and that's actually somewhat closer to the size of a seminar that I had in mind. So that's good. But so long to everyone who tries to join us from here on out. Let me hit share, desktop, and now full screen for the PowerPoint. All right, there we are. So until 12:35, I want to try to look at today's key concepts and questions. All right, key old concepts. That is, this isn't all the concepts we've had so far, but it is the concepts that we've had in prior sessions that are going to remain particularly salient today. Agreeable, good, beautiful. I should have had sublime in there as well. Universal validity, purposiveness without purpose, taste, reflective versus determinative judgment. I take it that we all know more or less what these are. I wanted to make one somewhat prefatory, but perhaps enlightening comment about taste, which will be very important in the readings for today. As in English, the German Geschmack suggests in the first instance, gustatory experience, right? That is the way food tastes in your mouth. And that, at least when I was rereading this yesterday, signaled to me, came to seem to me to be revelatory of a really curious problem in the critique, which is that especially in the passages that we're reading for today, there is a lot of, what's the word, contemptuous talk of the aesthetic insignificance of the culinary arts, in scare quotes, right? And a lot of kind of signaling of something that we've seen already, that Kant does not consider gastronomy worthy of study within the context of a philosophical aesthetics, right? Now, I'm not saying it is worthy of study. I'm leaving that completely neutral, and it might seem insignificant to you. But it's significant if you think of the fact that Kant is constantly going back to analogies of recipes, and indeed that the key term that he's using to describe this huge philosophical problem is one that in the end comes from an experience as simple as tasting a dish, right? Which again, in his official line, Kant would want to say is not a very interesting experience because it's only an experience of the agreeable, whereas what gives us a real philosophical punch is the experience of the beautiful and also of the sublime, even though that is, for most purposes, too interesting. The sublime is too interesting, so we'll reel it back to the beautiful. So this question that I kept coming back to as I was reading for today was, this guy sure is reliant on examples and analogies and vocabulary, indeed vocabulary, of gastronomy for someone who wants to say that it's not relevant, right? So that's just a preliminary remark, and we're going to look at some of the particular passages today, and I'm going to try to convince you that this is philosophically significant. The way Kant tries to draw the boundaries of what he studies in aesthetics is significant, even if what gets left out might or might not be significant. I don't know whether there should be a philosophy of gastronomy or not. That's not my point in highlighting this as interesting. One further point, I mean, you know, and this is the only time I'll ever mention the rift between different philosophical traditions, which I ordinarily think is unfortunate enough to be better left unmentioned. I'm talking about the so-called analytic and the so-called continental traditions. And there are very many ways you can understand this. Now, hold on. Oh, I see. I do get admits even when I'm sharing screen. That's good. So yeah, that makes me less concerned. One thing I can't see when I'm sharing screen, and I have full PowerPoint presentation, however, is your chats. So if you're sending them in and you're saying this is interesting or you're saying this is boring, I don't know, but I'll see them later. So do keep them coming in. All right, so the third critique is often seen as if we're speaking in cladistic terms, the last common ancestor of, and Kant's philosophy in general is often seen as the last common ancestor of, you know, Derrida and Donald Davidson, right? And so it's valued for that reason by many people. You could also say, I mean, there are a lot of different ways of characterizing what this rift is, but there's one point that has often struck me personally as a kind of way into understanding the nature of the rift that I never hear discussed anywhere else, and that is the salience of examples, right? So, for example, you'll often hear analytic philosophers complaining that theorists like Judith Butler, for example, are hung up on examples as if they were the thing that is significant. So a theorist, a continental philosopher, is trying to understand a text from a classic text from the history of philosophy, and gets hung up on the actual substance of the example chosen by a given philosopher, right? So I'm thinking, for example, of this famous critique, and you're not going to believe this, and I can't see the chat, so no one's going to be able to tell me. Oh yeah, Martha Nussbaum critiquing Judith Butler for her, that is Butler's obsession with Austin's use of the example "I thee wed" to illustrate what a speech act is, right? And Butler apparently has this whole thing about how that example proves that Austin and analytic philosophy in general are preoccupied with heteronormativity, right? And so on and so on. So Nussbaum says, that's ridiculous. This is just an example. One example is as good as another. Why are you getting hung up on this, right? So I take this little aside because I want to say that, you know, in the conciliatory spirit with which one ought to read the third critique, I take it that we should neither go overboard with Judith Butler nor be all that withholding with Martha Nussbaum, but we should hold open the possibility that Kant's examples are revelatory, right? That we can learn something by paying attention to the examples on which Kant makes his supposedly deeper philosophical points, right? And that's not a kind of no holds barred deconstructive reading of Kant, but it is nonetheless trying to get sort of behind his surface claims and understand what's on his mind as he's writing this stuff, right? That's what we're doing. We're not deconstructing, we're just trying to understand. All right, so enough of that. Key new concepts. Very quickly, I only have a few more minutes and I really want to get to John's presentation. Key new concepts, and I see there were some chats coming in, but I can't see them for now. Key new concepts: deduction. This is not logical deduction. This is Kantian deduction. It's something that comes back throughout the critical project, and we need to make some effort to understand what that is. Objective and subjective, I just want to say very briefly, this is an example of terminology that has historically been in flux in the history of philosophy. It meant something to talk about objective reality for Descartes, for example, meant something very different. The objective reality of a thing for Descartes is the reality that it has as an object for someone else, for example, in the mind of God. And in this case, I could be wrong, and I want to signal that this is a point where I could be wrong. In this case, by contrast with Descartes, when Kant uses the terms objective and subjective, he uses them pretty much in the same way we do, right? That is, objective is that which holds equally no matter who is doing the holding, and subject is just the opposite of that. Now, an interesting term paper, if we were doing such things here, would be to prove me wrong and to show that objective and subjective, in fact, are special terms that require special analysis in Kant. And one way of doing that would be to pay attention to the history of the development of these terms from, say, Descartes through Kant. Common sense, this is important, and we'll get back to this in the presentations and then in my revisiting of the material from the presentations. This is a term that has a wild history, if you think about it. Kant means it first and foremost in the sense that seems to be suggested on the standard reading of Aristotle, where when we usually use the Latin, Kant himself uses the Latin. The sensus communis is the hypothetical faculty that enables a person to apprehend, for example, that the cup that she sees and the cup that she feels are one and the same cup, right? Your sense of vision isn't permitting you that, your sense of touch isn't permitting you that. So what is doing it? Well, the common sense, the sense that unites all of the different sensory modalities. So that's the meaning of it in Aristotle, and Kant is drawing on that meaning in his own discussion, but it also means a lot more. Now, I'm going to go very quickly here through these terms because I want to move on to the presentations. Freedom is something that's going to be very important throughout the rest of the third critique, and you could say it's coupled with notions like genius that are not yet part of what I'm ready to discuss today. And freedom is invoked in the reading for today as the special, I don't want to say power because that's a technical term, but the special oomph, the special je ne sais quoi that makes an artistic creation what it is, and that also significantly distinguishes the beauty of a work of art, both from the free natural beauties that we talked about last time, like seashells and parrot feathers and so on, but also from the decorations that a South Sea Islander carves into his canoe, right? And the fact that it's freedom that is making that difference and that bounds the European fine arts off from indigenous arts, I think is really important because it kind of shows the political stakes, or you might say the ideological stakes of Kant's analysis of what art is, and that's connected obviously with enlightenment, which is also important across Kant's philosophical project and will also be important in the readings for today. But in the interest of time, I'm already 3 minutes over. Let me do stop share and try, like, within 2 minutes to have a look at these comments. Whitney Shah says on Geschmack, oh, this is a long, oh, I think I'm going to skip this. This is super interesting, and you're right. Yeah, it is this very conventional usage when you say things like "Das schmeckt mir," that pleases me. But I think we have comparable synonyms, or sorry, comparable idioms in English and French. Taste, le goût, Geschmack. In all three cases, it seems to me that taste is this very free-floating, idiomatically widely distributed term that is nonetheless anchored in actual physiological gustation, right? So yeah, it's strange that way. All right, I see there's discussion between Ognian, John. I think in the interest of time, what I'd like to do now is just turn things over to John, whom I'm very happy to have here. I think I have to unmute John. I don't know.
Do that.
Oh, you can do that. Oh, okay. If you can do that, yeah, okay.
You can mute me. I can unmute me, and so yeah.
I see. Well, I won't mute you while you're talking. It's really great to have you here, John. John is someone I also know from Paris. You spent some time in Paris like 2 years ago, and we met there. You were a fellow at the Institut des Études Avancées. Now, remind us where you are. Just tell us briefly.
I'm at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire.
Right.
And
yeah.
So, yeah, I'm not a Kant expert, so.
All the better.
I'm a fan.
Yeah,
and that's about it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. So, you know, I won't go very long. I mean, you want me to just go into this and start talking about 30 to 40, and then we'll see where we get?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, folks. Thanks for organizing this, Justin. It's been fun. I missed last week, but I did watch most of it so that I had a sense of what people were talking about. And today I need to cut out at 1:45 or so because I actually have a committee meeting at 2, which is ridiculous. But anyway, that's what we have to do. So 30 to 40, let's start with thinking about what. So I find 30 to 40, it contains some of the more helpful passages in this part of the third critique. It's also frustrating why it's built the way it's built. I think he could have made it a lot shorter. I think the point is very straightforward in a way that's not manifest necessarily. So but that's my opinion about this. Let me just move on to just want to bring up my own notes here so I could keep them in mind. Okay, so here's the weird thing about what would a deduction be? Like what's this word deduction supposed to be, right? So why does Kant say he needs to offer a deduction, right? And as Justin points out, it's not a sort of deductive argument. It's not meant to be that, but it is meant. It is the thing we need to do when we're encountering something that we're not sure. We're trying to make sense out of something, and we're not sure that what we've done does make sense. Right? So what Kant does, as you see it in 32, 33, he says there are 2 logical peculiarities to a judgment of taste, right? That it's very strange. And logical here just means structural. There's something odd about them, right? The first peculiarity, he says, look, it's really strange, right? Because when we make judgments of taste, and you talked a bit about this last week, I kind of demand everyone to agree. I want everyone to agree with me. Like that's it. I want everyone to agree, okay? And that treats a judgment of taste as if it were objective, he says. So, and that is the expression that he uses, as if it were objective. So if Justin doesn't think that rose is beautiful, I actually want to change his mind, okay? And likewise, if he thinks it's beautiful and I don't, I want to change his mind to thinking it's not beautiful, right? I mean, we just do not deal with disagreement when it comes to aesthetic judgments in the way that we're happy to deal with it when it comes to judgments of the agreeable, for example, right? You don't have to like the chocolate ice cream if that's not what you're into, but you better think this rose is beautiful. The problem is the second peculiarity, because when we disagree about things generally, and we think it's worthwhile resolving that disagreement, so I'm not happy about the disagreement, I'm going to give you an argument. I'm going to try to convince you that you're getting it wrong, or be open to being convinced that I'm getting it wrong. The problem, this is the second peculiarity, is that I can't give you an argument like that. Right? There are no such arguments when it comes to judgments of taste. You can't just say, well, just read this and this will explain to you why it's beautiful, right? I just can't do that. It's not available to me. And in that sense, these judgments of taste are acting, as he says, as if they're subjective, right? because there's no real rule built into them, right? I can't sort of say you're going to like this, you're not going to like that, and I think this is beautiful and you don't. So now now I can show you why. I can't do it. There's nothing I can really do. What I'd have to do, if Justin doesn't agree with me about the rose, is perhaps literally manhandle him and move him around the rose. Look at it this way. Look at it that way. Try again, right? But sort of like, whacking yourself on the head or reorganizing yourself with respect to the rose is not much you can do, right? At least not obviously. I want to talk a little bit about what you might do. But it's certainly what you can't do is give an argument, right? And this is connected in 34 to the point that he says, look, there's no principle of taste, right? I can't give you rules, right? So when I'm doing, it's interesting. This is something that was noticed by Arnold Eisenberg in an interesting way. But one thing that's funny about art critics is they often give you arguments, or at least things that look like arguments. This is why this is an amazing quartet, right? This is why this was an amazing performance of that quartet, or something like that, right? And it looks like an argument. It looks like they're giving you premises and a conclusion, but they're not, right? I mean, they're doing something, but what they're not doing is giving you an argument that you'd follow along, like you'd follow along an argument in your logic class or something like that, or an argument about the speed of light or something like that, and getting a conclusion. You can't do that. In order to make a judgment of taste, you have to be there, you have to do it. There aren't any rules that seem to govern that, right? And that seems strange. So when we're in this situation, these two peculiar features of a judgment of taste, it's fair for us to ask, is it even possible to do this, right? We could be screwing ourselves up, right? We could just be following our ideas along in a way that's getting us into this weird, awful place where we're insisting that something is a certain way when actually it really can't be. And in those contexts, you kind of want a deduction, meaning you want something that's going to convince you that a judgment of this weird sort is possible. So what he's going to try to do is convince you that, yeah, I know this sounds really weird, but it's possible, right? And that solution is going to be, his answer in the deduction is going to be, you might say structural. I like the word structural because it's not a word that he uses. So I don't have to worry about exactly if I'm getting this right. He uses the word formal, but in a couple of different ways, right? So there's a kind of structural claim that he's making. I can make these judgments. You saw that in the 4 moments. He's like, I think this is what's going on. We do this all the time. What is it that we're doing? How is it even possible? Right? So anyway, so that's how I understand the need for something like a deduction. He doesn't think we need this for judgments of the sublime, right?
Right.
The sublime is not confusing in exactly the same ways. Right? So that's where I basically think we are, and then notices that there's a sense in which you saw in the moments, right? The second moment, right? This is a judgment that's universal, but without the application of a concept, right? Okay, so he notices that when we're making these judgments, it's not like taking a concept, chair, and applying it to something, and that is what the judgment looks like. It's not like taking a concept, beautiful, and applying it to a chair, and that's what the judgment is like, right? And so you get this thought in Kant that this can't have much to do with a specific tool that the understanding has for making sense out of what it's presented with. It has something more general to do with how the understanding works and what the understanding does. Like its job is to engage with the intuition, okay? Or also you could say the imagination more generally speaking, but the idea is that in sensing, and by the way, this applies to gustatory, olfactory, audible, visual, tactile, kinesthetic, and any sense you care to imagine. These things are presenting you with things, right? There's a sense in which they present stuff to what? Well, to the understanding. I mean, just to think of these presentations as independent of the understanding is a little bit weird because it's not clear what they'd be, right? And to think of the understanding as independent of these presentations is also weird because it's not clear what the understanding would be doing, right? But what you're getting is you got these intuitions, they're thrown at you. And what the understanding does is throw concepts back and sorts them out and makes sense. So you see an apple on a table, the understanding, it doesn't ask you for permission to do this. You just look out there and you say, apple, table, right? That's just what the understanding does. That's its job, okay? since there aren't any rules, I can't say, well, as long as it's an apple, it's beautiful, or as long as it's an apple that's red, it's beautiful, or anything like that. I can't write rules. A judgment of taste is something like, it has something to do with, for Kant, what the understanding is doing in relation to the intuition, right? But not with any particular act, you might say, of the understanding. It's weird to call it an act because it's not always an act, but there's nothing in particular, any specific thing that the understanding does isn't the issue. It's actually something much more structural. It's like what the understanding's job is in relation to the intuition, and the intuition's role there is what the intuition does, right?
Right.
In relationship to the understanding, right? And this, and so what's strange about this is he thinks that sometimes, and I think actually in 35 you get one of the nicer, I think it's confusing for one reason, but like one of the nicer descriptions of how this is supposed to work. I think I moved in my book to where, but but one of the things he points out is this. He's like, you've got the intuition and you've got the understanding. Right? Okay. What's supposed to be going on is sometimes, and this is just not, this is, you know, sometimes you're presented with something. He'll call these things that you're presented with at a certain point aesthetic ideas, but you're presented with something in the intuition. And your understanding does its work. Apple, chair, whatever, right? But some of those things that you're presented with are such that the understanding doesn't feel like it's done. It's not finished. You see an apple on a table, usually like, okay, apple table, move on. I got it, right? Some of these presentations are such that the understanding wants to, feels like there's something more to do, right? And that's kind of purposiveness, right? This thing that you're presented with is something, right? And it could, and it's not just an apple, right? So it's something, right? But the understanding wants to do this. And the way he describes it, which is both confusing but helpful, is he says there's this kind of reciprocally animating sort of process that goes on. So this presentation to the intuition gets the understanding active. The understanding wants to sort it out. The intuition, in a way, resists it getting sorted out. It's not resisting, but it's as if it's resisting because it's purposive. There's something there, but I don't know what it is. And it's some ways in which that happens are very reinforcing, such that you wind up doing what Kant calls make this reflective judgment, right? It's about the engagement of your understanding and your intuition with one another. And he calls this the free play of the faculties.
Yeah.
And so Kant's point, now the deduction is super actually simple. That's why it's sort of interesting that it's, you know, I don't know, it's like 15 pages, but the deduction is really kind of simple. Because Kant's point, in a sense, is this. I can't involve, concepts are out, right? So concepts, they're always there, by the way. When I make a judgment of taste, even a free, pure judgment, an independent one, so not anhängig or, you know, anything else. Whenever I make these judgments, I've got concepts being applied all the time. That's just what the understanding does, okay? But when I make a judgment of beauty, it's not none of those concepts is the ground of that judgment, right? None of those concepts that happen to be applied are actually relevant to the judgment that's being made, right? And what makes us different, inter alia, are the concepts that we've got, right? What makes us different are the needs we have at any given moment. Some of us are hungry, some of us have to go use the restroom, whatever. Well, I'll have these weird sort of preferences. But Kant's thought is just this. He's like, as long as, and he doesn't actually argue for this, just not here at least, to the extent that I can presuppose that as agents, qua our intuitions and understandings, we are structured similarly. When I make a judgment that does not involve the application of any of my concepts to that does not involve my needs or any of that, so that genuinely is independent of all of that, all that's left is something that makes me exactly like all the rest of you. And in that sense, it is appropriate for me to demand of you that you agree. because it is qua experiencer and understander, so qua judger, period, that I am making this judgment, and not qua guy sitting in New Hampshire on lockdown or something like that. And so, but that's so that's all he thinks he needs. He's like, look, you want to know how this is possible? It's really strange that we make judgments like this, but this is exactly how it's possible. We have faculties that work in a specific way. And as long as I can presuppose that your faculties are like mine, and he thinks I can, I'm allowed, it makes sense that this kind of judgment is something a priori I can know, has this universal character, is necessary, right? And in effect, that, so I'm just, taking a look here. And I think, so it's important maybe just to remark that the deduction, I'm just keeping track of time too, the deduction does not justify this presupposition. So Kant is not actually here looking for an argument that we are all the same qua our faculties and the way that they work. Okay, he thinks that that is true and that he's got reasons for believing that, but that's not the point. That's why he says this deduction is kind of simple. I've given deductions before, they're a pain in the behind, and they are, like in the deductions in the first critique, are very hard to understand. There's the A deduction and the B deduction. We don't know how to understand them. This one's like, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Good for you. And then, his thought is, as long as what we're doing in making these judgments is really leaving out all of this stuff that, as it were, makes us different, right? There's a way in which these aesthetic kind of judgments, they're a kind of common sense, a sensus communis, right? And that the way we can be confident that the ways in which we're interacting with are similar, right? And that's a very interesting sensus communis. It's got very little to do with the understanding in any of its particular applications to things, right? Like the way we usually do. Common sense, don't throw money away and stuff like that, that kind of silly stuff. It's more like, it's about what our senses are, right? And what judgment is that we have in common. We get to know that. And this will matter for when he talks later about beauty being the symbol of morality and things like that, and other things like that. This is an interesting place where this stuff gets connected. I guess what I wanted to do is just raise a couple. I've just been timing this like a couple minutes. Is that okay, Justin? And
absolutely. No, you're doing great.
Raise like a few questions. I had 5 questions, but they're very quick to ask, if not quick to answer, right? So first question, I said, what Kant thinks is going on in these judgments is that there's this kind of free play of the faculties, right? And all of that stuff. And I could describe it pretty clearly. Like there's a sense in which the understanding feels like it's got work to do. The intuition is giving you something that seems like work should be done, but nothing really works, right? Okay. So there's this mutually enhancing kind of play and stuff like that. Why is this pleasurable? And where does pleasure come in? Right? I know that, the judgment of taste in, the way he describes it in the moments and so on, it's subjective, it's a feeling of pleasure, right? But what is the feeling of pleasure, right? Why does it have to be there? Can you imagine a dispassionate judger of beauty such that, yes, that's beautiful, but it does nothing for me? The fact that that's hard to imagine is interesting because it doesn't structurally seem built into the free play thing that it's pleasurable, right?
Yeah.
Second,
can I just jump in?
Sure.
Now, at the end of your first of 5 questions, let me encourage other people to gear up to answer these rather than just defaulting directly to me. So go ahead.
Absolutely. And I think these are questions actually that they're actually fun questions because you can really work with what Kant's given you and try to work things out and try to make this happen. So for example, the second question, why pleasure and what about displeasure? So one thing that happens in here, he's very clear in 36 that a perception can be immediately combined with a feeling of pleasure, but also displeasure. Right? But why is displeasure not actually interesting in his discussion of aesthetics? It's really not. And that's an interesting, enduring question about Kant. What is this? Is there such a thing as a displeasure that's built into the form of the interaction between our faculties? And he doesn't suggest that there is, but he does mention displeasure, and he seems to know. Third, he does say that there's this reciprocal relationship between the intuition and the understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually have no idea how the understanding is changing the intuition here. I
Right.
get that the intuition is getting the understanding going, but I don't understand. And it's very, I checked in the German, it's very clearly reciprocal is the word that he's using.
Mm-hmm.
It is, let's see if I have it right here so I could,
Gegenseitig. Oh, wechselseitig.
wechselseitig, yeah. Wechselseitig. So it's really clear that it's supposed to be a mutual sort of reciprocal kind of thing, but I don't know. Fourth question and fifth, they're very connection. What's the role of concepts here? So I actually think that, like I said, the understanding, its job, it's always throwing concepts at things. So even when you make a free, independent judgment of beauty, you've got concepts being thrown at your intuition, and effectively too. If it's an apple, your understanding is going to give you that, right? In some cases, and in particular in the art cases, so artifice, and it's also relevant to teleological judgments that I'm sure Justin knows more about than I do. I don't know that part of the book super well, but concepts matter. And so it's interesting that there are two kinds of aesthetic judgment you can make. You could judge a painting to be beautiful in an independent way. It just gives you this presentation to your intuition that gets your faculties going and so on. But you can also judge it to be a beautiful painting. And in that case, a concept it might not be the ground of the judgment, but it is playing a very important role in whether you judge it to be beautiful. Something might not be beautiful simpliciter, but nevertheless be a beautiful painting. And that actually, and notice that when Kant gives his examples, he first was the rose, but the other example was a poem. And if you think you're going to understand a poem without applying concepts in a significant way, you're wrong, right? I mean, it's not, Kant doesn't think. Formalism, we could talk about what he means when he talks about form, but he can't mean that in making judgments of beauty generally, we just prescind, right? Just refuse to apply concepts to a thing. And in fact, very often the application of the concepts is very important for us making the relevant judgment. And we need to think about how that works, because I think the dependent judgments of beauty are super interesting and worth thinking about. And they're the ones that structurally are going to be related, I think, to teleological judgments more so than the free judgments, the independent judgments of beauty. And related to that would be the fifth question: what's the role of cultivation here? So the one model of this, I actually think might be two. One is Kant insists that you can make a mistake about whether you're making an aesthetic judgment. Right? So very much toward the end, he says, as long as you're not screwing some of this stuff up, you're making an aesthetic judgment, but your interests and other things might get involved. So one way in which you can cultivate taste is to learn how to bracket things when they need to be bracketed. But another means of cultivation relates to these dependent judgments. Unless I know what painting is, it might be hard for me to judge of a painting as such that it is a beautiful painting. And that's another way in which cultivation is going to work. But those are very different. One involves understanding your faculties and how they work and setting things aside when they need to be set aside. Another involves actually having a fairly sophisticated grasp of a practice. And with that, I'll stop. Sorry, I went over a little bit.
Oh, no, that was all very much appreciated. So thank you. We'll kind of simulate applause here. You've got the rave reviews coming in the chat. Like I said, I would have a lot to say about at least 4 of those 5 questions that John threw out. And we've got about 7 to 10 minutes that we could easily devote to them. Does anyone want to jump in and try to start responding to them besides me? I can start, but again, I would love to hear from other people as well. The question of the pleasure that accompanies a judgment of taste, I think is so difficult to really get a handle on as something distinct from mere pleasure, right? And I mean, this is I've often worried just, the latest iteration of a long history of prejudice in the history of philosophy, where philosophers from Aristotle through the Stoics and Descartes and so on are trying to give an account of some more exalted state of, we can't call it pleasure, because that's what Aristotle wants to deny is true happiness, but some more exalted state of just feeling good, right? That doesn't implicate the body, for example, right? And in 17th century philosophical reflection on laughter, you're always getting these efforts to kind of typonymize typonymize, let's say, laughter into the kind that merely kind of triggers spasms of the body, which is reprehensible and should be avoided, as opposed to the elevated kind of state of the soul of which a slight grin is a mere kind of outward sign. And I was thinking about that as I was reading that interesting passage that you already evoked, where Kant is discussing the beauty of the flower. And it really struck me there that Kant says, when I judge of the flower that it is beautiful, I feel like I have the right to compel your agreement, right? In contrast with my judgment of the flower that it smells nice, right? In which case you tell me its smell makes you dizzy. Who am I to disagree, right? But what if the guy next to you says, well, you think the flower is beautiful, but it makes me, as it were, visually dizzy, right? I look at it and it makes me dizzy. I can't smell, I'm smell blind, but it makes me dizzy to look at this flower. And here, there's a lot to be said about whether this passage is an instance of what's sometimes been called oculocentrism, right? Kant is able to forget the fact that vision is a sensory modality that is grounded in the body no less than olfaction is. So he's able to pretend that the judgment of the beauty of the flower is not sensory modality dependent in the same way that the judgment of the smell of the flower is, which seems difficult to justify just on the basis of, kind of elementary understanding of physiology, but also kind of forces us, I think, unless I've misunderstood the first question, forces us to really engage with this question: what is the nature of this pleasure that we call the judgment of taste that really distinguishes it from the judgment of the fine smell? And therefore also, why is the so-called nose, who works in the perfume industry, a nose is someone who's really good at smelling perfumes. The nose of the perfume industry is not doing the same kind of work as the art critic, like at all, for Kant. What is the difference there? What is that extra thing? John has very nicely kind of summarized this as having something to do with the way the judgment of taste forces you or compels on you some kind of apprehension of purposiveness, which might indeed be a difference. Why you absolutely could not also be induced into that kind of reflection on purposiveness or induced into a reflective judgment in general by the smell of a flower is something I'm not sure I understand. In other words, I'm not sure I understand the difference between pleasure, between agreeableness and beauty, but that's just me. So does the pleasure constitute the judgment of taste? Is it a result of the judgment of taste? Either way, why? That was the first question. Yeah. It can't constitute the judgment of taste, right? Because I take it that agreeableness is also pleasurable, right? I mean, they're different vocabulary items, but I take it that the one trivially implicates the other. All right, let's hear a little bit from Ognian and then from Whitney. Whitney, your input is long enough that I'd rather just hear it from your mouth. But Ognian first, and then I wanted to say a little bit about the fifth question, and which you might want to throw into the chat for us so that we can all see it, John. And then we're going to have to move on, unfortunately. So Ognian, then Whitney, then a little bit about the fifth question, and then Alexandra's presentation. Let's hear Ognian.
So I want to say about the difference between the pleasure, the agreeable, and the beautiful. Mm-hmm. So you actually suggested Kant might be giving precedence to sight instead of the other senses. But if we go back to paragraph, I think paragraph 7, when he was speaking about the wine, remember?
Yeah.
So he also gave the example about the color purple. And so he said, well, purple, a certain color can be agreeable or disagreeable. So basically, the agreeable can function with all the senses, actually. So the difference between them is that the pleasure in the agreeable is only only personally, or it's valid only for some person, whereas for the beautiful, we just presuppose it should be valid for everyone. And so in a way, we can say, well, I see this color, or I see this painting, and I can just say, well, I'm kind of conscious that maybe not everyone would like it. Yeah. And I would say it's only agreeable. So, so in a way, the difference is in that presupposition that everybody could like it. Right. They're both pleasure. They're both based on feeling. But with the beautiful, we just presuppose that everyone could like it. Right. And I guess here there is something about those questions John referred to when he was asking about how the understanding is involved. Yeah. Because Kant kind of hints that the understanding, that's paragraph 9, and then the fourth moment. That the understanding has something to do with this universality, but he doesn't quite specify. Right. That was. Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ognian. That's very helpful. I'm being slightly facetious when I say I don't grasp the difference. And the way I might actually better say it is I just fundamentally disagree with Kant that this is a legitimate basis of such a distinction. But I try to hide the fact that I disagree with the person we're reading when I'm running a seminar. So that's why I phrased it in that way. But I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. Whitney, do you want to jump in briefly and
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, this is just to like add on a comment to what Justin has been saying about the distinction that we seem to be making between higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And I just like wanted to reinforce what he's been saying. So if I remember correctly, that I was taking a class on medieval literature, and this seems to have been a distinction like between higher and lower senses for a while historically, that vision and sound were considered to be closer to the divine and superior in terms of the senses, whereas smell and taste and touch were considered to be inferior and closer to animals in terms of the senses. And I think, like, that's a distinction that has persisted, or some sort of prejudice that seems to have persisted throughout history. Because like, if we as we have been discussing Kant and different kinds of aesthetic pleasures, and when people want to bring up kind of purely intellectual pleasures when it comes to art, they seem to gravitate a lot towards say like paintings or music or books, or those are the examples that we bring up most often. But people don't seem to bring up good cuisine or perfumes or nice smells or those kinds of things. So it seems to be a prejudice that we're still holding on to, and it's kind of interesting to think about like where it might have been, or where it might have like originated within history, and what were I mean, whether this seems to be sort of like a historical inheritance that we've gotten.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I try to be careful in the way I kind of identify and call out prejudices in Kant's work. I mean, on this particular one, you might push back and say, well, look, if we had evolved with different sensory modalities being more pronounced, or if we were like dolphins or bats and had sonar, if we just had a very different way of apprehending the world, then our art would also be different, right? But that there just is something about our visual representation that has indeed kind of propelled the visual arts into the center of our attention, both as a as a species, but also as critics and as philosophers of art. And that's not so much a prejudice as just the way our apprehension of the world forces us to go about things. And certainly, you can think of more recent, say, 20th century on efforts to incorporate more sensory modalities into what's presented as a work of art. I mean, my favorite example is some point in the mid-70s, John Waters started doing aroma-rama experiences with his movies, where he would pass out smell cards that you were supposed to smell at various points as the movie goes along. And this didn't fully catch on, as we'll notice in hindsight. And you can say, well, people just aren't as visionary as John Waters was, or they're more limited. Or you can say that is a fundamentally different kind of addition in the history of the cinematic arts than, say, the introduction of sound circa 1928 or something like that. That completed a natural aesthetic experience, whereas aroma-rama pushed us beyond the limit of what we're prepared to think of as an aesthetic experience. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'm just kind of riffing here, but in part to kind of reel back a bit what I've already kind of encouraged seeing as prejudice in Kant. Now, but also, Kant also is remarkably not prepared to accord as much philosophical attention to music, and thus to the sonorous art, as he is to the visual arts. And that's something I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss before our seminar is over. But thanks for that, Whitney. John's fifth question, which was also very good, that I wanted to, I see a lot of, oh, I'm not going to read through all of this. I just want to go. Oh, fifth question about cultivation. Two sorts. One is where you bracket interests, don't confuse matter and form. The second is you just learn about a given art, like, for example, painting, how it works, so that you can make dependent judgments of taste about paintings. Yeah, I mean, the reason why this question interests me, John, is not because I'm able to answer it, but just because of something that you said in connection with it, which is, you know, that in a sense, we are able to acknowledge our error in judgments of taste, right? You can say, I was wrong. And if you say I was wrong, it starts to look a lot more like beauty is indeed a concept of the object, as Kant explicitly denies it is several times over the course of the deduction. Beauty is not a concept of the object, but when you acknowledge that you were wrong, that looks a lot like you are, you know, correcting a conceptual mistake, right? And certainly the idea that, and you know, here I will call out Kant on his prejudice, the repeated indications throughout this part of the critique that South Sea Islander, who is pleased by the biomorphic patterns he has carved into the side of his canoe, is in very important respects in error, right? If he thinks that's beautiful, he is making a mistake and can be corrected, right? How can he be corrected? Well, presumably through cultivation. And as we'll see later in the critique, as we'll see in the teleology and the reflections on history, this correction through cultivation is also the same thing, will turn out to be synonymous with joining the Enlightenment bandwagon, right? And being enfolded into world history. And so that then means that it's almost like a tautology for Kant that if we're, you know, that I expect my fellow people to make the same judgments of taste as I do, these are only subjectively valid, except that I'm kind of the implicit presupposition here is I'm only making them with fellow enlightened people, right? And if you're not enlightened, if you don't share in enlightenment, then you can indeed be corrected, and you can, so to speak, your judgments can indeed be shown to be objectively invalid, right? But for that, I would rather wait until we get to the teleology. Okay, just I'm seeing interesting chat comments coming in. However, I would like, in order to be able to accord to Alexandra enough time and attention and, you know, time for discussion afterwards also, I'd like to just go over to her presentation now. Alexandra, are you there?
I am. Hello.
Hi, and you can turn on your microphone. Okay, good. Hi, Alexandra. I hope we haven't made you wait too long, and I hope you're still raring to go.
I am.
Good. Okay. So you're at Santa Cruz, right? You're a postdoc at Santa Cruz.
I am.
Okay.
I'm a grad student, actually.
Oh, you're a grad student. Okay, even better. It's great to meet you, and I think we'll just jump in, and then hopefully it will generate some discussion afterwards, like with John. And as I think Alexandra originally wrote to me saying that she was particularly interested in certain of the passages between, in let's say the second part of today's reading, and I said, go ahead and focus on those passages if that's what interests you most, and you can try to do an overview of the whole reading, but don't feel pressure. Just cover whatever strikes you as most salient and interesting.
Okay, great. Well, I actually made a little PowerPoint to keep me on track.
Oh, great. You can do that. Yeah.
Right?
Uh-huh. Oh, wonderful. Okay, I was just about to say that I felt guilty that I was the only one that could do that, but here's your screen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to thank everyone, and Justin particularly, for getting this started. And I want to thank John for that amazing presentation, because I was going to sort of quickly go over all of these concepts from section 30 through section 40, just to sort of set up the problematic of the things that I'm interested in talking about. But I'm pretty sure you've talked about all of these things: autonomy of taste, subjectivity, freedom. We've touched on all of these things.
It never hurts to go back over something that's already been done. So don't feel like you have to edit yourself in light of John's presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't actually. I feel very liberated, actually. So I can just, I mean, of course, if these issues come up again, and they do, like, this is why I think it's important to flag all of these things, but I'm mostly wanting to focus on how interests can be attached to disinterested judgments, and what really is the distinction between nature and art for Kant. So without further ado, I think I'm just going to move on and just give us this little recap of what judgments of the beautiful are. And of course, we already know this. They're disinterested pleasure in the free play between the imagination and the understanding. And they're based off the form, not the matter, and that's purposiveness without a purpose. And I think thinking about these definitions in this way is helpful when we ask these questions, particularly the distinction between nature and art. So purposiveness, a property that the object has, it seems to be a result of an end or a purpose. And the purpose is the actual idea that causes the object to exist. So when we get to section 41 and section 42, Kant talks about how interests can be attached to the beautiful, even though he makes very clear already in the third critique that judgments of the beautiful are the kind of judgments that are disinterested. So this is a really interesting question for me. Taste, he's defining as satisfaction of mere reflection on an object, and interest as a further pleasure in its existence. So not only are judgments of taste not supposed to have interests as their determining ground, which he reminds us in section 41 when he introduces the first kind of way interest can be attached to the beautiful. So we might think, okay, so interests are not supposed to be the determining ground, and yet, like, we can have interests afterward, namely empirical interests and intellectual interests, which we'll discuss. But actually, if we go back to section 2, he talks about how the pure judgment of taste does not in itself even ground any interest. So this starts to set up a puzzle. It's very perplexing how interests have anything to do. How can we take interest in beauty at all if it's neither the determining ground, and the judgment of taste does not in itself even ground any interest? So it turns out that taste, the faculty of taste, has to be represented with something else first, and that the interest doesn't result from taste at all, really. It results from whatever it's combined with. And so this is where he jumps off in section 41. If the judgment of taste itself does not ground any interest, what does? There's two types for empirical interests. It's something empirical, namely an inclination that is characteristic of human nature. And so for this, he's meaning mostly an inclination to society. So he gives these examples of people that might live by themselves on a secluded island or something like that. And they would have no reason, of course, to decorate their dwellings with flowers or charms or things like this. So importantly, these are charms, right? No reason to make their abode charming in any way, because we only do that for others, which is an interesting question I think we could talk about. If that's really true, like if we really would only bring flowers into our home and decorate our lawn and things like that for others, maybe it's true. I'm not sure. It's a good question. And also, we have a chat, I see. I can't.
You don't worry. You don't need to respond to chats. Yeah.
Oh, I need to go backwards though. Well, whatever. Okay, I remember what it says. So, and for intellectual interests, it's a faculty of the will, something that has nothing to do with any a posteriori factors like living in a society or something like that. It's something that occurs to us because of our faculty of reason. So this intellectual interest is sort of just like a more significant kind of interest, and more significant primarily because Kant says that it's a mark of a good soul. And importantly, this is the forms of nature, not the charms. The charms of nature, again, and this is related to our previous discussion, the charms of nature are something that we can take an interest in, but of course that those are mostly going to be empirical interests. But the form of nature can incite in us an intellectual interest, and why this happens is really an important story for Kant. Connects to the larger project of the third critique, of course, connecting freedom and nature. And the story about reason, reason's always on a lookout, right, for the objective reality of its ideas. And so whenever there's sort of a hint or a correspondence to reason's ideas, there's necessarily an interest, and it's a moral one. And this is like, Justin, you were talking about this at the very beginning. There's a very moral story of when we find our ideas, reason gets excited, as it were, because there's this special correspondence, and we see that like we're not alone in the world really, but that nature is sort of on our side. It's amenable to our ends. It's purposive, not just in itself, not like this isn't just its teleological purposiveness, but it's purposive with respect to our faculties and the play between the imagination and the understanding. And this is such an amazing thing. So we see that someone who takes who's moral is necessarily interested in nature and necessarily interested in this correspondence. But importantly, this is not true for art. So Kant says that people that take an interest in art, virtuosi of taste, there's this empirical claim. They're usually vain, obstinate, giving to corruptive passion. That's one reason. And then the other reason is, of course, that there's not this important affinity to reason's ideas, because we have an experience of the purposiveness without a purpose in nature. We're able to say, wow, this really speaks to my ends, and yet I can't find the actual idea that caused this object to exist. I can only sort of see that it happens to speak to my faculties in this certain way. And so I necessarily look within myself and my own ends, which is the moral vocation. And of course, we don't do that in art in the same way, Kant says, because in art we say, okay, the idea that caused this object to exist, of course, is the artist, and yet we can't find that in nature. So there's this important this important turning inward, reflecting in on the moral vocation. And so there's like moral lessons that we learn in this. And Kant gives amusing examples of a landlord that hires a flautist that can convince the nightingale quite convincingly, and fake flowers being planted and things like this. And interestingly, and like sort of obviously, it's not really the object itself that determines if you're able to take a moral interest in it, right? It's the reflection. So it has to accompany the intuition, but also the reflection that nature caused this object to exist. So when we're strolling through the garden and we hear the nightingale song, we're able to take an interest in nature because we're like, wow, nature's just creating this thing that makes me reflect on my moral vocation. And yet, when we find out that it's a flautist and the landlord hired this person, immediately our interest drops, or it becomes some sort of empirical interest. Then we think, oh, I should hire this flautist to play at my dinner parties. And it becomes this thing about charm and society. So it's an interesting story because it's about the reflection. And the reason I'm sort of setting it up this way is like, I'm going to start to bring a critical lens or talk about like, what exactly is the difference between art and nature? Because maybe the landlord hiring this flautist, like part of the reason our interest drops is also because it's a matter of deception, which of course is going to be problematic for Kant in many other ways. So maybe it's less that it's beautiful art and that it's not nature, and maybe it's something about deception, or maybe when we think about like originality and exemplary qualities of the genius, maybe it's also because it's like a direct imitation of nature and not something sort of without a rule. So those are some interesting questions to consider possibly when we discuss this. But I was just thinking, since we talked so much about the hierarchy of charms, of course, it's strictly the forms of nature, as you see this quote here. And yet the charms in beautiful nature are frequent, and they aren't unimportant morally for Kant insofar as the color and sound as sensations do seem to contain a language that nature brings to us that seems to have a higher meaning. So he talks about the white color of the lily seeming to dispose the mind to innocence and in these things, but of course, like smell or touch, that would never count in as things that would dispose the mind to sort of like moral ideas and things like that. And so it's interesting because charms can play some role, and we'll see later that charms can play some role in section 59 and in symbolic reflection between beauty and morality. There's some relation to charms and moral ideas, and yet it's very specific which kinds of charms could accompany forms and not just be merely something that incites an empirical interest in us. But to sort of move onward to this question of what's the relationship between art and nature, and why can't art ever indicate a moral disposition, a mark of a good soul in someone if someone takes an intellectual interest in art? We have to ask the question of what really is different in the forms of art and nature, because both are we judge both to be purposive without a purpose, right? So there's a sense in which we don't have an idea of what caused art products to exist, but it's a different sense in which that occurs to us in nature. And in section 45, beautiful art is the art to extent that it seems at the same time to be nature, Kant says nature was beautiful if at the same time it looked like art, And art can only be beautiful if we are aware that it is art and yet it looks to us like nature. So in judgments of nature, there's no concept needed of what the object even is. And just as John sort of posed the question, what about if we sort of know all the facts about the painting, and then when we have these concepts at play, and then that maybe can inform our impure judgments of taste, or things like that. We might think the same thing about nature if we study nature, and of course Kant talks about the botanist and things like that if we know about flowers. But we don't need to have a concept of what we're judging in nature to make a judgment of the beautiful. But for art, of course, we do. We need to know that it's art. And so that's another flag of like what's going on in the flautist. We're not judging it as art, we're judging it as nature, and then it immediately shifts. So we get this question of how can art be beautiful at all, really, for Kant, if it's purposive without a purpose, and yet we are judging it with sort of an explicit purpose, an artist made it, right? This is kind of like a big question in Kant, just as how exactly do interests even play any factor in judgments of beautiful at all? And the answer pretty fundamentally relies on the theory of genius. The function of genius is pivotal in Kant's theory of aesthetics. The artist doesn't have a determinate and knowable rule to be able to appeal to when they like ask, how did you make this beautiful thing? And instead they have this, it's ineffable, really. And what kind of, importantly, the like language that fills this ineffability is the language of nature. So Kant says genius is the talent, the natural gift that gives the rule to art, and nature and the subject must give the rule to art. So the sort of precise wording of what is this rule that gives the rule, what is this rule that makes art even possible, is nature. And so we might wonder what really is the relationship between art and nature, and does that affect the way that one might be able to take an intellectual interest in art, if really if the artist, or the viewer of art rather, could see art as being sort of an extension of nature speaking through the subject into the work. And of course this might make us think of like the sort of post-romantic tradition that follows Kant. Of course, we see much more willingness to kind of play off of this idea in Schelling and Coleridge and Emerson and such. If nature is speaking through the artist, then maybe we could take an intellectual interest sort of indirectly or something like that. It's just a question to maybe kind of consider. But the function of nature, of course, is really pivotal, because otherwise the artist's sort of appeal could only be to following rules by direct imitation of artists before them, which of course would not create genius art. Then they would not be original, or thinking that they've sort of come up with a rule that one could follow to fill this sort of criterion for exemplary quality. And yet it's completely void of either of these things. There's just this ineffable rule. And so it kind of makes me also wonder like how genius plays, this notion of genius might play an account in the phenomenology of artists, and how we want to kind of understand artists' work. Because at first, maybe when you think of this idea of genius, you might take a critical lens and, think that it's like the story of Newton and the apple, and someone sitting under a tree, and then an apple falls on their head, and they're like, and then suddenly they paint Guernica or something like that. And yet, And yet, like, there's something about it that seems quite right, really. Like, artists, you know, it seems like the more reflective and more humble artists are, the more that they don't try to say, like, this is this determinate and knowable rule that I followed when I painted this. It's like they've worked for years and years, and yet something then spoke to them and they created this work. So there's sort of an interesting question about what notion this plays on an art account of how artists created it all. But yeah, I think that those, since we have like only 15 minutes left, I think I'll probably wrap it there. I have a thank you slide to remind me to say thank you for all of you being so
Yes,
but,
thank you. Yes, yeah. yes. So simulated applause. I'm sure it's rolling in the chats. Thank you, Alexandra. That's really wonderful. And I also really like seeing the woods of the Santa Cruz campus, which I recognize and appreciate. Okay, I'm going to say a few words in response to some of what you've brought up, which I really appreciated. And then we'll see if there's any discussion, and then I think it's just going to be time to wrap up. First of all, about genius, I didn't put that on my list of concepts to master today because I wasn't going to get to it personally, but I've already indicated that it's crucial and that it's related to freedom as a central issue in the third critique. Genius is one of these concepts that has, like idea, for example, that has a strange history of evolution over the course of philosophy that we need to be sensitive to. We need to be sensitive to the way it is transforming in the particular moment Kant is using it, and largely because of what Kant is doing with it. Now, as Alexandra rightly said, genius is understood by Kant, and I think more or less by us today as well, as something for which you cannot give a rule, right? So your painting instructor can tell you, do a little bit more of this, do a little bit more of that. And thanks to your instructor, you might get really good, but if you are going to make the move to genius level, it's not because you are executing some instruction that your instructor or your textbook or anything gave you, right? So that's the idea of genius as we, as Kant understands it, and as we more or less understand it today. Interestingly, if you go back 150 years earlier, you will find, for example, I think the year is 1632, a treatise by Descartes called Regulae ad directionem ingenii, which we usually translate as rules for the direction of the mind, but which we might translate as rules for the direction of the genius, or of the ingenium, which we sometimes translate as mind, but also sometimes translate as natural aptitude, right? And if you think about it, and if we're willing to translate ingenium as genius, if you think about it, that would be a total impossibility in Kant's light to have a book called Rules for the Direction of the Genius, right? So what has happened as we move from the early modern period to Kant is that we've gone kind of inward to look for some special force, quality, je ne sais quoi, mojo, I never know how to find the right term for this, that is going to evade our attempts at outside characterization, right? Now, obviously, if we try to narrow our scope to the history of thinking about art and artistic creation, you certainly find even in, for example, Socrates, when Socrates is taken to task for saying the things he says, he tries to invoke the activity of the poets and say, hey, whoa, I, like them, am just channeling something here, man. Don't hold me responsible. I'm just doing what the poets do, which is something that, like the poets, I can't give a rule for, right? So this idea of a certain kind of human creativity as being that for which a rule cannot be given is certainly much older than Kant, much older than Descartes. Yet what happens is that in Kant and in the legacy of thinking about these questions after Kant, this comes to be identified with genius and centrally understood as as an exercise of freedom, right? So that's very curious, and we'll discuss that a lot more in coming weeks. I just wanted, and we can move to questions and comments in a second. I just wanted also to affirm with Alexandra that I'm also really delighted but somewhat confused by this example that Kant gives of the flautist hired by the landlord at the dinner party. It seems to me that the disappointment we feel there is simply has nothing to do with art and nature, but just with not liking being tricked, right? I mean, it's not that we prefer real birds to flutes. It's just that we prefer to know what we're getting into, right? And yet, that said, there's certainly a long history. I mean, there's a lot of reflection in antiquity on art as a sort of deception. And if you look at the way great sculptors in antiquity were described, like I'm thinking of all of these legends of Scopas, for example, who could create sculptures so lifelike people would want to interact with them, and you know, all of the tales of human beings and animals being trumped, as the expression trompe l'œil suggests, their eyes being trumped or deceived by art. That kind of one of the standard recurring kind of ways of accounting for what ought to be called good art, right? Good art is that which deceives. And yet that same thing also generates a certain kind of moral taint around art, which is the same one that led Plato to give his famously disparaging account of art as an imitation of imitations, and therefore unworthy of serious kind of reverence, right? Now, I would have a lot more to say, but I want to see if, and let me point out that because the presentations and the discussion have been so good, I haven't even done the thing that I told you I was going to do, which was give my own presentation on sections 30 through 41. Oh, I get it, Sarah's comment, maybe before quarantine, lol, because yeah, now it's like we all are in our huts, in our respective huts, and whether we decorate them or not is an interesting question. Let me see, the genius is quiet in his nature. Kant never uses the term mimesis, does he? I can't find it in the critique. That's Nicola Blunden. He certainly uses imitation, right? And I take it that mimesis just is the kind of somewhat fancier way of saying imitation, using the Greek. Are there any questions for Alexandra that I didn't get to? Any of our usual suspects want to throw anything in, or anyone we haven't heard from at all before? No. Okay, well, there are still a few minutes to jump in. I just wanted to maybe take some of this time to recap, to say just a little bit of what I would have said in my presentation. I think John was really right, I mean, to emphasize in his presentation how kind of succinct the deduction actually is when it finally hits after 7 or 8 sections of preparatory discussion of the method of the deduction of the judgment of taste, peculiarities of judgments of taste, and so on. When it finally hits, it's only a paragraph long, and it's kind of like, well, what other way is there? And if you're familiar with the extremely long-winded deductions of the first critique in particular, this comes as a great relief. But the idea, the basic idea of the need for a deduction of the judgment of taste is, in effect, that no empirical ground of judgment of taste, of a judgment of taste, can be given, and also no a priori ground of a judgment of taste can be given. And another way to put that is there can be no ground of a judgment of taste at all, and thus we're in a curious bind as to how to kind of legitimize, and there I'm using explicitly non-Kantian vocabulary, legitimize what we're doing when we make judgments of taste. So, you know, no a priori ground can be given, as, you know, as John said, art critics look like they're arguing, like they're making an argument, but in effect, and I really love the way John put this earlier on, that's only a kind of imitation of argument, right? Art critics can't argue, strictly speaking. So that's the no a priori ground. I wanted to say about the Kant's claim that there's no empirical ground of the judgment of taste, and he amusingly, you know, describes or mentions what it would be like if you sent people out to take a survey. That would be absurd. You know, that's not what we're doing when we call a painting beautiful. We're not. That can't be equivalent to saying, well, 85% of poll takers said it was beautiful. Right? Except, and this is just the final point that I wanted to mention, of course, you do have people, you do have serious kind of resistance or kickback to the claim that there can be no empirical ground of a judgment of taste. In the subsequent history of philosophy and of social theory more broadly, we can obviously mention in this connection someone like Pierre Bourdieu, who has a whole book called A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, right? Which is, in a sense, a response to Kant's third critique, came out in French in 1968, I think, that, you know, does exactly this. It surveys people on whether they like the Blue Danube or not, and then plots the responses according to social class and education level and so on, in effectively so as to say our judgments of taste are always conditioned by social forces, which Kant is trying to carve out a space of autonomy where they're not so conditioned. One final comment is that there's also, of course, in a very different tradition than the one Bourdieu is working in, we can think of, for example, Denis Dutton, who a few years ago, or maybe 10 years ago now, was kind of the primary advocate for a kind of evolutionary aesthetics, where he insisted that judgments of beauty are constrained by the same Darwinian forces that govern judgments of utility. I take, at least putting it like that, but also, my honest judgment is that that's an extremely simplistic approach. But more broadly speaking, there are potentially less simplistic approaches that do ground judgments of beauty in, broadly speaking, naturalistically specifiable constraints. All right, I'm gonna let me see if there are any. Someone says maybe Taine fits there too. Yeah, perhaps. I haven't read this. The first few chapters of the History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's certainly probably, I haven't read that either, but it's probably along the same lines as Bourdieu, showing that judgments of taste can always be socially critiqued. What we're going to try to do, though, is give as generous an account as we can in the sessions to follow of an author who wants to preserve these judgments from social critique, make them autonomous, and we'll see if we come out the other end still thinking it has something to offer. All right, it's 2:00 now. Let me just say thank you. Can't wait to have you back next week. This is obviously attendance non-mandatory, and as a result, we have very fluctuating numbers and a fluctuating list of participants. That said, I really appreciate the presence of our regulars, and so this is a big shout out and round of applause for those of you who are here from 12 to 2 each week. It makes it feel real, and I hope you can continue to do the same, even if obviously real life sometimes gets in the way. So we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.